This week on the Hollywood in Toto podcast, we explain why the Mouse House is crumbling right before our eyes. We talk with Brett Dasovic of Pop Culture Crisis and hear his great advice for striking Hollywood stars. They really need to listen. And we review an indie thriller that's legitimately thrilling, really.
Welcome to the Hollywood in Toto podcast. Entertainment news and reviews without the woke Hollywood narrative. Free speech, free expression. Now that's entertainment. And here's your host, award-winning film critic, Christian Toto.
Before we start, I hope you'll subscribe to the Hollywood in Toto podcast. We've got some more bonus episodes coming up, and Shea Toto's YouTube studio is getting ready for its close-up. Stay tuned. All right, raise your hand if you grew up without seeing one Disney movie. Yeah, that's what I thought. I can't see a single hand. None here either. We all did. From those goofy movies with Don Knotts to Old Yeller, we saw it all.
Quiet, Yeller! Don't rile her!
It's been true for decades, and that Disney brand is just bulletproof. It's like Superman's chest. Or it was like Superman's chest. We spent about 2 years just hearing all the horror stories out of Disney. Lightyear flopped. Stock prices are crashing. Disney Plus is losing gazillions. That's a rough estimate, but you know what I mean. Theme park attendance is slumping. Star Wars ain't the brand it used to be. But then again, neither is Indiana Jones or Pixar or the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Poor old Mickey's in a tight spot, and so much of it is self-inflicted. I'm not the only pundit talking about all the above, but I think what we're all missing here is how hard it is to recapture the consumer once your bond with them has been broken, or in the case of Disney, shattered into a million pieces. Again, this didn't need to be. We didn't need endless Star Wars TV shows. God, when was the last one that was good? Or those PC reboots of beloved properties. And we're talking about you, Oak Snow White. We see you a mile away. You know, when I was growing up, IBM was the bulletproof tech brand. Those three letters, IBM, they meant something. They had power, they had gravitas. You respected them. I was a dumb teenager. I knew that. Now, today, it's not IBM, of course. It's Apple, maybe Google. They command our respect. I don't even know what IBM is up to these days. But that brand recognition is priceless. It's why Coke and Pepsi spend millions on marketing every year. We all know them by heart. Coke, Pepsi, Pepsi, Coke. It's as American as apple pie. But it is easy to lose market share and get lost in the shuffle. There's always new competitors, always new threats to your business. Got to keep spending, got to keep the profile high, got to keep that connection with the audience. But that can't happen at Disney, right? All right. It's happening before our eyes. The Mouse House has alienated millions. Some are sick of the woke stuff, I get that. Others are more savvy about social media and the news, and they know all about Disney's not-so-secret gay agenda. Yeah, that's a direct quote. Now, for the record, I have zero problems with gay Americans, none. But I'm not keen on forcing mature themes about sexuality down the kids' throats. And that's what some of Disney product does. Not cool. The Disney declared war on the second most popular Republican in the country. Again, dumb. That's Governor Ron DeSantis. Not a good idea. Another unforced error. Just throw it in the pile. There's a lot of them out there. Team Disney took a beloved brand. They poisoned some of the products. They shredded its apolitical pose. And they injected themselves directly into the culture wars. No regrets. No course correction. Full speed ahead. Still, what were they thinking? So much of what's happening across the culture today is going to be fascinating to watch years from now. Like, why did the left abandon free speech? The potential fall of Disney, or at least its degradation in the minds of millions, that falls into that category too. People will need to study it years from now. And I think historians will note the most shocking part of all, it didn't have to happen. But it's happening right now. Few shows have a better title than Pop Culture Crisis. The Daily Show, hosted by Brett Dasovic and Mary Morgan, dissects the latest Hollywood headlines. It feels like a crisis on a daily basis, doesn't it? Man, such insanity coming out of pop culture land. Now, there are a lot of podcasts and YouTube shows that cover this material. There are a dime a dozen. So why is Pop Culture Crisis different? Well, got to start with the show's hosts. Brett and Mary are smart. They know their stuff. They know that they've watched tons and tons of movies and TV shows, and they have good insights this year you're not going to hear in most shows. It isn't just gossip. It isn't just blather. It isn't just a bunch of hot takes. It's far more sophisticated. It's also very funny. It's occasionally serious, too. They approach some pretty tender topics at times, and it's not politically predictable. I think a lot of conservatives will flock to the show. They are already, but it's not a left-right thing. It's not a tribal game. Much more complicated than that, much more nuanced. Brett explains his own political situation in a minute. Yeah, a few weeks back, we had Mary on the show, and I wanted to have Brett on just as a follow-up. Now it's his turn in the hit hot seat. I really wanted to find like a behind-the-scenes snapshot of the show and find out if he had any special thoughts about the Hollywood strikes. It's the topic of conversation right now. Everyone has a different hot take or maybe even a lukewarm take, but what he shares in a few minutes is very interesting and something I hadn't heard at all before. But I'm not surprised by that. It's what Brett does on a daily basis. And I really hope that some of the creative class, get out a paper and pen and take some notes. I think you could do them some good. Now, of course, I hope everyone checks out Pop Culture Crisis, but for now, let's get to know its savvy co-host, Brett Dasovic. Brett, you've got a very cool gig. There's no debate there. But, there's a lot of prep work that goes into any show, especially yours. I was there. I was behind the scenes a little bit. I got a sense of it, but I didn't get the whole scope. Can you share what it takes to put on a show like this, the reading, checking out different news sources, and also, are there any maybe obscure news sources that you peruse on a daily basis that we might not expect?
Yeah, so I think the most interesting part about it is it does first of all, to preface beforehand, is that it is the coolest job in the world. And when you point out things that can be unique or sometimes challenging about things like this, people have this tendency to think that you're complaining or saying like, well, go work, if you worked with your hands, you'd be singing a different story. It would be very easy. It's not to say that I don't have maybe the coolest job ever. I do have possibly the coolest job ever. But when you put a lot of pressure on yourself to deliver a product to people each and every day, 5 days a week, that they'll find entertaining, it does require a certain amount of, work from the ground up to figure out, first of all, what that's supposed to be, to navigate how the tone of the show is going to play out each and every day. That seems to be, to me, one of the hardest parts to figure out, which is that, do you want to be serious news? Because whether people would like to believe it or not, there's still plenty of serious things that you can talk about in relation to entertainment, whether we're talking about celebrities in trouble with the law, how entertainment has affected the culture at large. All of these things could be taken in a serious manner. But the problem is, you don't want to do that 5 days a week when you're also blending in things that are fun. So you have to navigate where a segment is placed in each show, because I was actually just talking on a stream Friday night with a YouTuber named Colonel Kurtz. If you don't know her, you should go check out her channel. And I was pointing out how one of the things I had to learn early on was, like, if you place a serious topic after you talk about something fun, or you do a segment where there's a lot of interaction with people and there's laughter, I would notice when I was cutting segments up that as I was cutting into something, the next segment where you're talking about something more serious, there's still like remnants of that topic left on your face. And when you're going to edit those segments together, it makes it look like you're not taking it seriously. So there's all of these little things that go into organizing each show, figuring out, first of all, who are the most reliable places to get information from? What does your audience want from you in regards to what you're covering? All of these things have to kind of be figured out in a sort of trial by fire. You figure out as you go, what segments do people take a liking to? Which ones do you want to talk about regardless because they're important to you? All of that kind of has to be put together into this almost amorphous package that has to come together as something that's interesting enough for people to tune in 5 days a week and watch. And that's a lot of content to deliver to people when, there's only so many breaking stories every week. So you really have to find a way to make it all work and keep people coming back for more.
Yeah, and that's the thing I wouldn't even think about as far as the tone. I never I assumed this and that about the program and how it flows. But yeah, absolutely. And if you do a topic that is serious and is sober and you add too much levity to it, you kind of break your bond with your audience. I mean, they expect something different. So that is important. Are there any quirky news sites that you've fallen into where you think, I know people don't read this often, but actually I found it reliable and interesting and I get some good stuff out of there?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, I'll give TMZ credit, that people give TMZ a lot of credit, but for the most part, I found that their pop culture reporting is actually fairly neutral, which I appreciate. Like they don't put a lot of spin on their articles. They deliver you the base information of each story, because a lot of it is current events, right? It's this happened on this day. This is what they said. We did a story today where they were talking about Jason Aldean being protested by communists in Chicago, and they called them commies in the article. And it was funny because they're saying like they're self-described. That's what this isn't, Breitbart calling them commies. This is the actual group calling themselves communists. So I find their reporting for the most part to be pretty sobering. Also, like, depending on what you want to talk about, like I have different sources where I go. If I'm looking for straight news from Hollywood, you can get a lot from the Hollywood Reporter or Deadline or things like that. Now, we don't do as much, like depending on the day or the week or the guest, we'll lean into that more heavily. If we're looking for general pop culture news, I'll go to sites like TMZ or things like that. And then if we're looking for stuff based on, like, a lot of times if you want to get stuff that enters into the culture war, you have to check out Newsweek or the New York Post or Breitbart, and then take those biases into account when you're talking about it. Like, look, I understand that this site takes this approach, that's their approach, not necessarily what I'm looking to describe there. And then for the stuff that I find a lot of times the most interesting, which is like culture stories, so things regarding TikTok or things regarding YouTube and social media, you go to sites like Indie 100 or Dexerto, which have a lot of these stories which relate to influencers or things going on in the social media sphere, which people who might be aging out of that demographic, and I believe our audience trends like 30 to like 25 to 45, I think, is where our audience trends. So a lot of that stuff, they might not be looking for things like that. So I find a lot of very interesting stories on there that are just good if you're looking to have a general fun discussion with a group of people, kind of like a revival of the idea of water cooler talk, which has kind of been demonized these days. It seems like every issue has made something
That's
like
right.
we talk about. But it's like, well, they've politicized the weather, so you can't even talk about the weather at the water cooler anymore. I like the idea of being able to have these ridiculous stories where it's like, look, the story's ridiculous, the people involved are a little bit ridiculous, but everybody loves to hear something like that once in a while. And I think that makes for interesting discussion when you have 3 or 4 people that all might have a different take on it.
Yeah, and sometimes those little pithy stories actually have some meat to them, or you can put together some kind of connect the dots about what does this mean at the big picture. And by the way, before we move on, the fact that TMZ is in a sense a beacon of neutrality, maybe that speaks volumes about how bad the media has done in general. But you're right, I do find them to be both reliable and often down the middle with occasional curveballs here and there.
They'll editorialize once in a while, but like for the most part, like me and Mary joke, we're like, who has the best job in the world? It's the TMZ cameraman who just get to shove a camera in a celebrity's face and ask obnoxious questions. That has to be the best job ever.
I think it's the best and the worst, but I'd be wildly uncomfortable. But obviously, they don't have the problem there. They've got a callus built over their soul. Now, you have a finger on the pulse of the audience at this point. You mentioned them, the age demographic in question. What are you learning about them along the way? I mean, when you do a show like this, there's such interaction, there's such feedback. You say this, they jump in with that. Are there frustrations that maybe aren't being addressed in Hollywood right now, or things that they're dying to see, but just maybe the studios aren't delivering?
I think there's a lot right now. I think there's a lot of resentment and apathy, meaning that a lot of people like, look, we've covered the strike as much as you can cover the strike in Hollywood without it becoming overtly boring and over the top. Like, I don't want to make 9,000 segments on what David Zaslav or Bob Iger have said about these strikes. Look, it's interesting, and there are whole channels dedicated to these things that do fantastic work getting into the weeds, like the Disney channels. The channels that cover Disney do unbelievable reporting. They do. And it's just when you're a channel that covers it, that's one thing. But when you're trying to make a discussion that's interesting to a group of people who may not really all have interest in that every day, you can't really devote that amount of time there. But what I've noticed the most from the audience is like when we talk about the strike, they're like, good, let them go on strike forever. Who cares? Like they would much rather watch YouTube than they would watch what's going on in Hollywood right now, because at least for our audience, which is going to trend center right to right, they don't feel like their stories are being told. They don't feel like they're being taken into account. They're frustrated with actors, producers, directors, and Hollywood elites treating them like they're scum. And in a lot of ways, they've checked out. They get mad at us because we go to see these movies and we review these movies. And I talk all the time. I'm like, look, I believe great art is worth saving, and I believe that reviewing this art that we're seeing, or what some might call art, still does what they would consider our side. I don't like the idea of calling them sides, but there's a political divide there. I still think it does the right thing by giving them a fair look at these things, and I try to be very honest in all of my reviews. Look, I liked it for this reason. Look, I didn't like it for this reason. You can boycott all you want, but us reviewing it, and if we don't like it, is going to, people in this space, YouTube commentators are very powerful in the sphere now as far as getting their message out there. Channels with huge followings, the Geeks and Gamers people, Jeremy Johns, Chris Stuckman, those are vastly different things. Chris Stuckman and Jeremy Johns are movie reviewers, but a lot of these channels have a lot of sway over audiences, and I think they're turning to them far more than they are just biting into everything that Hollywood feeds them and taking it, without asking questions. I see a lot of resentment from the audience, especially when it comes to the movie industry.
Yeah, it's funny. When I first got in contact with Gary from Nerdrotic, and when I first joined your show, I just assumed you were both right of center. And while you may sort of dabble in that area, you're not a tribalist, you're not I'm a conservative, period, full stop. And I find that fascinating because I feel like a lot of the people in the space you're describing fall into this it's hard to pinpoint what you are. There's no label, but there's just this general unease, this general frustration that unites people like you and me, and yet it doesn't have to necessarily transcend into politics. Can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, is it just not getting what we want, and that's we become this odd pop culture party in a sense?
Yeah, I hear the term disaffected liberal a lot, and I think that like, for me, like, not talking politics, I feel like I don't consider myself a conservative at all. I don't. I find myself to be somebody who 10 years ago, 15 years ago, would have just been considered a normal liberal. And now I think that term has kind of been boxed up with what they call barstool conservatives, which I don't like that term either. But there is this general feeling of unease when the movie industry started to push into this sphere that blatantly fell into identity politics, that seemed to sacrifice excellent storytelling for checking boxes for the sake of their DEI departments. I think that a lot of people would consider that cultural kicking off point to be Ghostbusters 2016. But I think that a lot of it goes back, and these have been aspects of Hollywood that have been there for far, far longer. But what it felt like to me was there was always a money aspect to the industry that prior to 2016 kept the far leftism from overtaking the storytelling and allowed for a little bit of give and take in these departments, meaning that you had an industry full of creatives that lean left. Nobody would deny that. I don't think Hollywood would deny that. And they were met in the middle by a corporate entity that said, look, we still have to appeal to middle America.
Yeah.
Now, they may have done it grudgingly. They may have done it by looking down on them. And I do believe they did. You can watch any TV show that represents, back in the day that would try to portray middle America, and you can see a certain amount of disdain and superiority coming from the people who produce those shows. It's all over the media for a longer time. But at the bigger budget level with your major motion pictures, you still had to appeal to as much of the country as possible. Now, with the way that funding is done, with the way that these companies are invested in heavily through stakeholder capitalism, larger corporations, they're all, a corporation of a corporation of a corporation, and it's consolidating heavily downward to smaller and smaller entities, right? Disney, owns many, many, many smaller corporations. Warner Brothers, now owned by Discovery. All of these things, they don't have to appeal to everyone because it seems like they're very, very good at either just moving the money around, staying with DEI formula for their corporate entity. It's like they don't have to worry about how the average person views their movies. And I don't even have a whole lot in the way of negative to say about the movies this year. They've just all been very meh. Like, to me,
Yeah.
I didn't hate any of them, or that's not true. There was a couple that I really, really didn't like, but for the most part, like the biggest tragedy is that I don't think there's been one movie that I've seen in the last couple of years that I want to watch again.
Yeah, that's maybe the biggest selling point for me about a movie is I can't wait to watch it again, whether it's next week or I want to wait a year to make it look fresh again. But that is a faint praise for sure. And I think what's interesting is that it feels like there's money left on the table when you think about the conversation we're having right now, where you don't have to be right of center, you don't have to be left of center, but if people can kind of push past certain box checking apparatus and just tell a rocking story, that I think they could rally behind that. And conversely, though, because the landscape is so splintered, you can be successful with a modest audience. Yeah, I'll never forget Jimmy Kimmel said about being left of center and losing his Republican fans. He said, not good riddance, but riddance. And because he knew he could survive, and that may not be forever, but it's just so interesting. There are things you talk about in the show, which I'm sure get a lot of reaction. I Mary Morgan got some heat about the Richmond song. Are there topics that you would think are completely benign, that are completely safe, that actually do cause a kerfuffle with your fans?
That one did a lot for some reason. I was shocked by how I do find that both sides of the aisle, no matter how much you tell everyone that you're open-minded, that you're willing to hear all perspectives, there are certain things that you're just simply not allowed to criticize. And both sides have things that they say, that's her take on that song is a perfect example of one. Suddenly everyone's telling you don't understand this song, you don't get it, and nobody owes anyone an explanation, especially when it comes to art.
Yeah.
Like, if I don't like a movie, I can do my best to articulate to you why I don't like it. But if you really, really like the movie and you're very, very set on this, and it's one of the things that I always laugh about. We talk about this it was very big in pop culture even before this. Like, there's things you're just not allowed to not like. You're not allowed to. I think that Batman Begins is better than The Dark Knight. I don't care what anyone says. That is my personal opinion. And if you disagree with me, that's fine. But there are people who take these things very, very seriously. And they say, how could you say that? How could you say something like that? You're clearly wrong. And I say, no, it's art. I'm allowed to like whatever I want to like. You're allowed to like whatever you want to like. And we can have a fun discussion about it. But when it starts to turn into politics, that gets unbelievably grating, and it makes me roll my eyes.
Yeah, yeah. One thing about your show is that you talk a lot because that's the gig. You have to keep us entertained. You have to keep the show going, and it's all about conversation. And of course, you could make a misstep. You could get a fact wrong. You could say something you meant to say X. You said Y. And of course, we're living in a very unforgiving culture right now where people are waiting. Oh, yeah. The sharks are waiting to circle. How do you navigate that? And have you gotten into quote unquote trouble for that at all at this point?
If I do, it's because I misspeak on some like basic fact that I get wrong, and then somebody in the chat will inevitably correct me and tell me that I'm an idiot, and I say thank you for correcting me on that. If anything, I would say that it hinders me of my own accord, meaning that I end up being my own worst enemy. Speaking like when I'm talking, oftentimes I am one of those people that's so concerned about being misunderstood or speaking wrong or saying the wrong thing that I end up speaking in a less than it's less than fluid, right? So it ends up affecting my delivery on a lot of things. So I end up having an easier time when I'm either on IRL or I do another appearance. It's easier for me to just talk freely when I'm not the one in control of the facts or the narrative of how we're trying to frame the story, meaning that here are the facts, here's what I feel about this story, here's what she feels about the story, how do you feel about the story? A lot of times that ends up becoming harder for me, and I'm actually very, very impressed now. The more I watch other people's shows, I have the utmost respect for people who do it well, because I see now how difficult it is.
Yeah, you've got to think about it. Like you mentioned before, the tone. There are so many things you must consume and process. It's the tone, it's the brand, it's the audience, it's the be entertaining. Tackle this from an angle that's authoritative but also engaging. It's so much stuff. One of the things, there's a lot of reasons to be negative about the culture. I think we've hit on some issues as well. Where are the great movies? We're waiting for them. But are there some upsides here, whether maybe the strikes will shake out in a way that helps the consumer, or you think there's trends bubbling up that you think are very positive? Anything kind of on the upside, you could kind of a glass half full thing you could share with us?
I think right now, the people who are upset at the entertainment industry are laughing because they're watching these people struggle. The people who have called them Nazis for the last 4 years, the people who have talked about income inequality, all of these things within their own industry. The big guys are suddenly speaking out and pretending as if they're the little guy because they have to speak out for the little guy now, right? You see a lot of that. But I think what it is I see a positive way forward for if I was to give the actors, for instance, the benefit of the doubt, I would say to them, look, you have the ability to do this on your own. I pointed the other day to a YouTube channel called Critical Role, which is a Dungeons and Dragons YouTube channel that was started by a bunch of very successful voiceover artists years ago and did very, very well. They from what I understand, have many, many hundreds of thousands or millions of followers. The videos get hundreds of thousands of views. I don't know how much they're releasing these days, but it spawned a television show on Amazon Prime called The Legend of Vox Machina that they originally crowdfunded, but then were able to sell to Amazon, right? So this started off as a passion project for them on their own free time. And what actors have to learn how to be able to do if they want to be able to come out of this is either you accept that you're not going to get everything you want from these companies because they're both at an impasse right now, or you understand, you put yourself in the position of these studios and you start taking the financial risk on your own and betting on yourself. And maybe just then, maybe just maybe, they're able to actually understand just how much these massive studios risk every time they make a movie when they themselves have to be the one that puts their own money on the line and they have to bet on themselves to come out ahead, right? Because what these actors want is they want to be able to take none of the risk, have all of the reward, while trashing the people that pay their bills, trashing the studios that try to get the business from the people that pay their bills. It's very interesting to see on all sides, but I think right now, in a sort of depressing way, the people who are angry with Hollywood are the ones who have kind of come out ahead.
That's a really great point. I want to add one minor addendum, which is just more of a philosophical point. I think that audiences, even the ones that are frustrated and angry and really upset at the tone of Hollywood toward the public, I think at the end of the day, they want to love actors. I mean, they bring them into their homes and they just think, oh gosh, if you meet a Tom Hanks in the street, you're giddy with excitement because it's Tom Hanks and you've loved his movies. And I think if they dialed back some of their attitude and if they had more empathy toward the audience, I think it would be healed and returned in time. So I think there's the potential, which is maybe my own glass half full. But Brett, before we let to go, I know you watch a lot of shows, you watch them again and again, and I think you often will catch programs that maybe just weren't hits. They were interesting. They just flew under the pop culture radar. Can you give us one or two that you'd really recommend just to kind of give people another option as the strikes go on?
Oh, that's
Is it like picking your children? You can't pick one? Your favorite?
I have First of all, I watch almost nothing new these days. I see the new movies. I have very little patience for new shows these days. I liked Twisted Metal was a new show that I quite enjoyed on Peacock. If we're talking shows that people might like that are older, Person of Interest is, in my opinion, the last great procedural that became a serialized show on television. It starred Jim Caviezel and Michael Emerson, ran from 2011 to 2016. People who watch my channel will understand that I'm singing that show's praises all the time. I would also recommend Banshee, which was on HBO Max, or just Max now, starring Anthony Starr. It's very pulp, a lot of violence, a lot of nudity, but it came out at a time that I really, really enjoyed how honest it was. I'm in the middle of rewatching Dexter right now. All these shows, there is more atmosphere in the cinematography in Dexter than I've seen in just about anything in the last 10 years.
That's a lesson to Hollywood. I mean, often, for years and years, people would say, "Oh, movies are better than TV." It was a case-closed argument. I think in many cases that has been flipped on its head. But that's one of the reasons.
I believe that television usurped movies a long time ago. I contend that the USA Network between 2008 and 2013 was the single greatest era of television that nobody will ever appreciate. Meaning, Burn Notice, White Collar, Covert Affairs, Royal Pains, Necessary Roughness, all of these kind of light dramas had not an ounce of identity politics, were extremely fun to watch, and in a lot of ways kept people coming back week after week after week. And they had a mantra on the network at that time. It was characters welcome. And right now you see a whole lot of focus on message. You see a whole lot of focus on agenda. You don't see a whole lot of focus on good characters. And I think that network at that time was maybe the best example. In Monk, Psych, all of these shows, and it's extremely underrated and extremely underappreciated. When everybody talks about these shows that everybody loves, they mention The Walking Dead, they mention Game of Thrones, they mention these high budget shows that got all of the attention. I think these other shows were ones that really stayed with the culture for a long time. Maybe they won't have the memory that all of these other shows do, but I bet if anybody who ends up listening to this or watching this, whatever this is, I think if they went back and watched White Collar or Burn Notice, they would be surprised at just how good the storytelling was back then.
Well, that's why I love checking in with you, Brett, because you had those observations that make me kind of sit up and take notice. And I follow this for a living, and you often lap me. So I appreciate your time, and thank you so much for joining the show. Of course, his show is Pop Culture Crisis. It's on 5 days a week at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. It's smart. It's funny. Got great insights like we've shared some of them here. And of course, it's covering the craziest Hollywood headlines. You can find it on YouTube, or you can go old school podcast. That's often how I listen to it when I'm on the go. But you could also follow the show on Twitter at popculture_show, or on Instagram at popculturecrisispod. Check them out. Great material. Brett, I really appreciate you being on the show, and all the best, and keep the pithy insights coming. They're really welcome and needed.
We'll do our best. Thanks so much.
Believe it or not, there is a downside to being a film critic. And it's not the lousy pay. It is lousy. And it's not the lack of respect you get from average moviegoers, because that stinks too. It also isn't just being forced to sit through a lot of terrible, awful, no good movies. I do that a lot as well. It's knowing that you're so rarely surprised by what you see in the theater. You know, film critics like me, we know the formulas, the patterns, the beats behind most movies. You know, in the horror movies, who's going to jump out, where the fake scares will be, all that stuff. Even the plot twists aren't so twisty when you've seen so many movies. You just can't help but notice things. But once in a while, a movie will sneak up on me. And man, when it does, it is a treat. And that happened with a movie called Good Boy. Now, it's a Norwegian import. It follows this man. He's very rich, very handsome, and he's trying to date. Can't blame the guy. He's single. But there's a problem. When he tries to date, his dog gets in the way. It's not just any dog, though. It's Frank the dog. And Frank the dog isn't actually a dog. It's a guy. It's his roommate. And he dresses up like a dog. 24/7. Dog costume, dog food, dog behavior. He pants. He's a dog. Except he's not a dog. Again, trying to date with a dog who's actually human might be complicated. But the new girl in his life is, well, she's immediately put off by it, but she says, let me give this a chance. I mean, heck, Frank the dog could be a charmer, you never know. And this guy is rich, and he is handsome, and he's very sweet to me. Why not? And that's when Good Boy gets really good. Plot description ends here, but there's a scene mid-movie that just rocked me. I think my jaw actually was agape. It took me completely by surprise, and it pushed the film in this exciting new direction. The Good Boy is only, about 80 or so minutes long. We're living in a time where every other movie is 2 hours, 2.5 hours. It's the perfect length. There's no fat. There's no waiting around. And I will say, this isn't for everyone. This isn't an all ages, all, audience kind of affair. But if you hear the description of the film, you think, well, that's not really for me. It sounds weird. It sounds too awkward and uncomfortable. Well, don't watch this movie, and I don't blame you. But if my description is interesting to you, if you're intrigued to find out more, I think Good Boy is a great choice. And the best news of all is on video on demand right now. Well, that's it for the show. Thank you to Radio America for having me as part of their great podcast lineup. And of course, while I have your ear, I hope you'll drop by HollywoodInToto.com. I update it 7 days a week. We've got news, reviews, and commentary on the wacky world of Hollywood. Even when the industry's closed for renovations, like it is right now, there's a lot to cover, and I've got it all covered. See you next time.